Hi guys, welcome to the channel. Thank you so much for clicking on today's video. My name is Ash if you've never been here before, and welcome to the Isle of Man. We are one of the very few places in the world right now, November 2020, that is COVID free, and we have been COVID free for 5 months. Our island, there is no social distancing, there are no masks, nothing. Our lives here are completely normal, apart from one thing, which is when we go away and we return, we have to isolate, and our borders are closed to anyone who is not a resident. So in this video, we are going to discuss how and when COVID came to the island, how the island reacted, what it did to stop the virus in its tracks, what it did to remain COVID free, and how we have been dealing with people who break those rules of isolation, as we are one of the only places in the world that is actively arresting and jailing people who have broke their conditions of their 2-week isolation. So if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing, and if at any point during this video you enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up. So let's get out of this backlit shot and welcome to the island that beat COVID. So before we start talking about COVID, let me tell you what the Isle of Man is like and what it's like living here. The Isle of Man is located right in between England and Ireland. It's a very small island, and it has a population of about 85,000 people. Now, most people know the island for its world famous motorbike race, the TT. It's held every single year. It's been held for well over 100 years, and it's an actual on real road motorbike race, and it's the biggest one in the world. People come from all over the globe every May, June, when the race takes place. The date changes every year, and it's a 2-week affair where the first week is the practice week and the second week is the actual main event, all culminating onto senior race day, which is the Friday, and we actually get a national holiday on senior race day, which is always the last Friday of the TT week. Another national holiday that we get extra from the rest of the UK and the rest of the world is the 5th of July, and that is Tynwald Day, the Isle of Man National Day. And most people probably think, the 5th of July, did they just copy America? Well, no, because the Isle of Man is actually the longest standing continuous government in the entire world. And although New Zealand does get credited with giving women the right to vote first, it actually was the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man is known for a lot of things globally, but my favourite thing about the island, and how appropriate that my cat just jumped up behind me, she must have sensed this, is that the Isle of Man is world famous for producing the Manx cat. I have a Manx cat, but not a proper Manx cat, because anyone who knows about them will know that they do not have a tail. There are 2 types of Manx cats, the Rumpy and the Stumpy, and they are just gorgeous cats and the sort of unofficial logo of the Isle of Man. Our national flag is the red flag that I'll put on the screen here, and we have the 3 legs of man, which our motto translates as "Any way you throw me, I will stand." And we have lots of cute little mythologies on the Isle of Man, including our ferry bridge, which when you drive past it, it's on the way to the airport for most people. You have to say hello and goodbye to the ferries, otherwise they might give you some bad luck. And lastly, although the national dish is known as the kippers for the Isle of Man, most people would strongly agree that our national dish is actually chips, cheese and gravy, and do not knock it until you've tried it, because Friday night everybody's at the chippy getting chips, cheese and gravy. It's fantastic. So now you know a little bit about the Isle of Man, let's talk about how COVID started in the beginning on the Isle of Man and what were the first steps taken by the government. So as Europe and most of the world were getting their first COVID cases and it was beginning to spread in the communities, the Isle of Man, because it's an island, it took a little bit longer for us to get a case here. And on the 19th of March was when we got our first case of COVID diagnosed. And it was due to someone who had travelled. Now, the Isle of Man is very small and everyone knows everyone, and the first case that was actually diagnosed was someone who worked for my landlord, and they had gone to Spain, got the virus when they came back. They had it fairly mildly, they didn't require any hospitalisation or anything, and they were absolutely fine after the illness had run its course. So by the 22nd of March, we had 3 more cases, all due to travel. Now, the UK had already gone into its lockdown on the 16th of March by the time our first case was diagnosed on the 19th, and more cases starting to emerge over the 22nd and 23rd. But because the UK had gone into lockdown before, we kind of had a jump start here, and before we even had our first case, most people in larger offices were working from home at this stage. The children were still going to school, but the following week all the schools closed and everybody was working from home. The border was closed on the 23rd of March, so we only had a handful of cases when this was done. People were told they could not leave unless there was extenuating circumstances, and then they had to apply for the government for a waiver. The only people who could return to the island were residents, and there was a bit of a scramble for people to come back, and there was a lot of people who went through a lot of hoops to get back to the island. By the 24th, 25th, when Prince Charles was being diagnosed in the UK, we had approximately 8 cases on the island, and on the 27th, as our cases were beginning to slowly grow, the entire island decided to implement a national speed limit of 40 miles an hour. Now, one unique thing about the Isle of Man is that we don't have a national speed limit. And although in school and work areas and towns, we do have little discs up with the 20, 30, 40 miles an hour, but the rest of the island, there is no speed limit. So putting this 40 miles an hour speed limit in was in the interest of safety, because we wanted to try and have as few accidents and issues that would require hospitalisation as possible, as the Isle of Man only has one small hospital. And there was a lot of kind of panic circulating, as this one small hospital does only have 6 ventilators. Through the end of March and the beginning of April, the lockdown here was extremely strict, and text messages were also being sent out by the government to tell people to stay home. There was no reason for people to leave their house if they weren't going food shopping, they weren't going to the pharmacy, or they weren't going to some sort of key work or work that they couldn't do working from home. So our police actually were setting up roadblocks, and things like one of the main places on the Isle of Man, Quarterbridge, where there's a lot of activity, people were being stopped, every single car, and I got stopped once when I was going to the grocery store, and all it was you had to wind down your window. They asked you where you were going. I said the grocery store, Marks and Spencer's, and they waved you on. That was it. But the Isle of Man also doesn't really have a lot of fast food or takeaways. I mean, we have Chinese, chip shops, Indians, those sort of things, but we only have one McDonald's and one Pizza Hut and 2 Domino's pizzas. That's it, nothing else. So the one McDonald's, which is on Quarterbridge, was quickly closed, and a lot of the restaurants started doing takeaway. By the 21st of April, we had 300 cases on the island. 200 were presumed recovered at this stage. We had 15 hospitalizations, 9 unfortunate deaths, and approximately 2,500 people were being tested. At this stage, the Isle of Man was still having to send their swabs away to England to be tested, so the turnaround was about 48 hours. Very quickly, a lab was set up on island, and the turnarounds for tests were extremely quick, with most people receiving their results the same day within 8 hours of taking the test. On the 28th of April, a phased border reopening plan was given out, but obviously we still were very strict. No one except residents were allowed to come back to the island, and anyone going away, it was really only on the grounds of either requiring medical treatment in the UK, as some medical treatments such as cancer treatments aren't available on the Isle of Man. Even when there is no pandemic, people do have to go away quite often for medical treatment, and the only other reason that people were permitted to travel were things like on compassionate grounds. After approximately 6 weeks, we moved into phase 2 of our coronavirus plan, and non-essential shops and retail were allowed to open. Now, when the pandemic was going on, only a number of grocery stores were open, and with the Isle of Man, obviously like everywhere else, we were having people line up outside, extreme social distancing, and parts of the rest of the shops were blocked off, places with clothes, etc. And it was very, very well done. People over here majorly respected the rules. There were very, very few people who broke them, and I'll discuss further along in the video how those people were dealt with by the government. On the 22nd of May, we moved into phase 3 with the first part of the hospitality business opening, such as restaurants and cafes, were still required to socially distance, and there were rules for spacing people out. But also during this time, the weather was very nice and people were also allowed to sit outside, so the outdoor seating was expanded in most places too. So let's talk a little bit more about how the lockdown affected me personally. We will also speak to a great friend of mine, Claire, who actually became a mother during the lockdown. And a little bit later on, we will also speak to another wonderful friend of mine, Katie, who is an entrepreneur, has her own consultancy business, and how everything affected her. And also, Katie had to travel several times during the pandemic, and she even was one of the people who got to travel when the border was set at level 5, and she had to get special compassionate leave okayed by the government and granted an exemption to go and visit her dad, who was unfortunately ill in Cyprus. So the lockdown here for me, because it was so draconian, very strict, you could not leave, go anywhere, and this was even in the very beginning, before there was support bubbles for people like me who are single and live alone. So I live just with my little cat, as you'll see her jumping around in the background sometimes. And during lockdown, it was very difficult for me. I was completely by myself and I was working from home. And anytime that you would go out to the stores, you'd be stopped by the police most of the time and asked where you were going. And I will lay a clip over the top of me talking now, that one of the times that I went to Marks and Spencer's, which is located in our main town, and this was on a Saturday afternoon when the streets are normally completely packed at this time. So it just went to show no one was really going out at all, only on those days that they absolutely had to go to the stores. And a lot of people, like my dad, he didn't go out at all for basically 2 months. He got all of his groceries delivered and he didn't cross the door. Now, I also live in basically what is a glorified granny flat, and it's an apartment attached to my landlord and landlady, who are fantastic. They're really good to me, and it's really nice to have someone there because we live in a very small village. And we also live kind of on the outskirts. There's the sea right here and there's a handful of houses scattered around. When we were in lockdown, they were really fantastic to me, made me feel like part of the family. In the summer when we were having cookouts and stuff, it was great. And just to see someone and to like wave to them was really nice. But in the very beginning of the lockdown, they were actually traveling, and there is no one around here, so I didn't see a human unless I went to the shops like once a week. My friends were really great because we would do like our girls' nights and things on Zoom. Most of my friends around the world, a lot in America, we'd be having all our normal chats and things, and obviously my friends who don't live on the Isle of Man were used to having that sort of thing. And I feel as though that is one thing that was great about the lockdown, that it got you really in touch with you know, everything's so busy and time zones and work and everything. So when you don't really have a social life due to the lockdown, it was great because everyone was available and able to talk. And I think people were recognizing this is what's important, having relationships with people. It doesn't matter if we go to some fancy restaurant or go to a play or go see the latest movie. It's about the people that you enjoy spending time with and the people that you love, and that's what's important. And more than ever, people have seen that is the main thing in life. It's not, you know, going out and spending money that you miss. It's being able to hug people and just see them and touch them and enjoy your time with them, rather than, oh, I'm gonna go and, you know, have a steak dinner and go and buy a Louis Vuitton handbag. Like, that's not what's important. As of course I'm aware, the UK is going into lockdown again on the 5th of November. My heart really goes out to everyone in the UK that's going to have to go through this again, because it, you know, I know they've said it's going to end in December, but there's no sure way of knowing that, and most likely it won't end on that day. And also just the whole, it's winter, it's cold, it's dark. You know, people who don't have the luxury of having gardens or terraces or whatever, they're stuck inside. And even people who do have those luxuries, it's the winter, it's raining, it's freezing. Like, people don't want to go and sit out in the rain. And if you're just confined to your house, like, it really, there's no other way to say it, like, it sucks. So we're going to go over to my fabulous friend Claire and talk about how lockdown affected her family, and what it was like becoming a new mother during the coronavirus pandemic.
I'm Claire. I have lived on the Isle of Man since I was 2, and I had my baby boy in February, at the beginning of February, before we went into lockdown.
How did it feel having a newborn during such like a stressful pandemic time?
For me personally, I feel like it was okay, because it kind of took the pressure off feeling like I should be out and about all the time. So I had my baby 7 weeks before lockdown, and obviously during that time we didn't know what was coming our way. We didn't know the world was going to go the way it went. It kind of feels like a blur anyway, those first few weeks. And then we went into lockdown at the end of March on the Isle of Man. For me personally, I found it to be okay, because I was quite happy to be in that baby bubble at home, just adjusting to motherhood. So for me personally, I found it to be okay in that way, because I didn't feel that pressure to have to be out and about all the time. Obviously, I didn't feel like that the whole time, because as the months went on, it did feel a bit claustrophobic, especially not being able to have my family be kind of in close contact with me and the baby and my partner. But overall, I found it to be okay, because I was in that baby bubble, so we were safe in that.
And since also obviously it was your family's first grandchild, first nephew, how did they cope with being so separated from you, even though you were so physically close, like just down the road?
Yeah, so we still saw them a lot, but obviously from a distance, which was really difficult for my family, not being able to have that physical interaction with the baby. So that was quite difficult, I think, for them. But we always made sure that we, at a safe distance, were still seeing each other as much as we could. And also, obviously, FaceTime and things like that were really useful and important during that weird time.
And how do you think the Isle of Man has done in general with, you know, getting to the COVID-free stage for so long too? Like, how does it feel to be able to go back to normal life, basically, apart from we can't travel?
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like we've done so well. I feel so lucky to live on the Isle of Man, where, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of aspects of life that have returned back to normal. such as being able to be social and being around family and friends and going out for dinner, going out for lunch, just going into town shopping, food shopping. Everything's normal in that aspect, but obviously there are other aspects that have impacted my household, such as my partner's working situation. So he works in the hospitality trade, and obviously with the borders being closed to non-residents, that's had a massive impact on the hotel industry, and so that aspect has been a little bit tricky if I'm sort of thinking about it from that perspective. But certainly from social side of life, it has returned to normal. Obviously, aside from the fact that we can't travel, we feel very lucky. Compared to some parts of the UK, we're incredibly lucky.
And having your parents here and like your sister and stuff is really like great for you. Is there anything about not traveling that's really like affected you, like not being able to go on holiday and stuff, obviously? But
yeah, I mean, there are parts of that are difficult. I am a person who's done a lot of travelling and haven't really stayed on the Isle of Man for too long without either going on holiday or travelling in some capacity. So that aspect has been a little bit tricky, I guess, a little bit claustrophobic. And also this year we were hoping to take my baby on his first holiday, and my mum turned 60. We were planning a big holiday, but I think there's more important things than doing that right now, and it's just really, I'm so grateful that all of my immediate family are on the Isle of Man, and I don't have anyone stuck in the UK that is in my immediate family, that I can't see. So I feel very lucky in that way.
Are you pretty basically okay with them? The borders are closed, and with, I know that we could go over for a while with the testing, but it's just kind of, it is what it is at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I think again, very grateful and lucky that we live on the island versus some parts of the UK, and I think that the Isle of Man government are doing the best that they can. Obviously, like I said, with my partner working in hospitality, that's really affected that industry, which is obviously not ideal, but I think for now the government are doing the right thing. I mean, it is what it is. Like, we can't really change anything. COVID is going to be here for a while. Who knows when? They'll get a vaccine together, and we'll be able to travel freely. But for now, we just have to be grateful for our situation in the Isle of Man and just keep moving forward, I guess.
After approximately 9 weeks of the virus circulating in the community, on the 3rd of June, the Isle of Man was declared COVID-free. There was no active cases of the virus on the island whatsoever, and on the 3rd of July, we were moved into a new phase of the plan where social distancing, mask wearing, etc. was completely done away with. On the 3rd of July, a new border framework was also announced. Over the summer, we moved from phase 5 of the border plan, which meant that no one except residents was allowed to return, and people were only allowed to travel on compassionate or medical leave. And we were moved into phase 4 of the border plan. Now, this meant that any island resident could travel to the UK and beyond as long as they were willing to self-isolate on their return for 14 days. Now, people were allowed to isolate in their own home, and if other family members were in the home, they needed to keep themselves in a separate room and, if possible, use a separate bathroom, and anything that, like kitchen materials and things that they used, needed to be cleaned thoroughly, and they were suggested to just totally distance themselves as much as possible within the home. Now, from the government standpoint, people who were living in a home with someone who was self-isolating were allowed to go about their normal lives. A lot of workplaces put in a measure where they told employees that if they were living with someone who was self-isolating, they needed to work from home for those 2 weeks. And also, even though the virus was not circulating on the island, if any employees had any symptoms of COVID, they were told that they needed to self-isolate at home for 2 weeks. And the same if they were living with someone who was experiencing symptoms. Throughout the summer, the Isle of Man remained entirely COVID-free. People went back to their normal lives. The only thing that was different was that if people travelled, they were required to isolate on their return, and also they couldn't have anyone over to the island. It still was only residents allowed to come to the island. From a personal standpoint, being someone who lives alone and was working from home all this time, it was incredible over summer to be able to just have a completely normal life, go out with friends, be close to people, even something as silly as hugging people when I saw them, going into stores, not having to line up outside, no social distancing, no wearing masks. It was amazing. And although obviously everyone on the island, I think, would agree that our sympathies go out to people who are suffering, whether it be actually with the virus or suffering in some way with having to be completely isolated from other people. And people's mental health has just taken a sharp downward turn with being alone so much and not just having that human contact on a daily basis. With a number of people looking to travel to at least the UK in September, with students returning to university from the island, as the island only has one university college, the Isle of Man College, and all of the university students would at least be travelling to the UK, and first year students would most likely have their parent or guardian going with them to move them into their residential dorm. Now, my brother, who is 18 and I'm very, very close with, he was going to university for the first time this year, and as my dad is going to be turning 60 next year, it was decided in my family that I would take my brother to university to move him in. And on the 3rd of September, the Isle of Man government announced that if you were to leave the island and come back, instead of doing the entire 14 days of isolation, on day 7 you could elect to have a COVID test, and if the COVID test came back negative on day 8, you would then be allowed to go to work if your work allowed it and it was not public customer facing. You would be allowed to go to grocery stores and you would be allowed to go to pharmacies. You would also be allowed to go out for exercise, not to a gym or anything, but one of the things with the strict isolation on the Isle of Man is that you were not allowed to leave your property, so you could only exercise in your own garden. Now, when I took my brother to England to his university, I of course elected to do the test when I returned. I took the test on day 7. It was exceptionally well organised. I returned to the island on a Friday night. I phoned on the Sunday to ask to have a test done. The gentleman who I had the call with was extremely professional. He booked me in straight away for a test on the Thursday, and I arrived at the grandstand, waited in a small line for maybe 15-20 minutes in my car, and the nurse that I dealt with was exceptional as well. She came up, briefly told me what was going to happen. They did one quick swab of my nose, and although it was uncomfortable for about 2 seconds, it was fine. And I drove home, waited the next morning, they phoned me, they told me my test was negative, and I was allowed to go to the grocery stores, etc. Then I did my remaining 6 days of isolation, and I was allowed to go back to my completely normal life. So that was my experience traveling during the pandemic and what it was like coming back to the Isle of Man, where everyone must isolate, and also my experience with the testing that is unfortunately no longer available. So now we're going to hear from my great friend Katie, who she has travelled the same time that I did and was able to utilise the testing system. And Katie also travelled during level 5 of the border control, and that was when she had to apply for compassionate leave from the government to go and visit her father, who was unfortunately unwell in Cyprus. So let's hear from Katie.
My name's Katie Nicholson. I am the founder of Petra Consulting and also the co-founder of Founded Isle of Man and director of Startup Grind Isle of Man. I've lived in the Isle of Man since 1998, when I moved over from Cyprus, where I'd been living for the first 8 or 9 years of my childhood.
How did the Isle of Man lockdown affect you, and how do you feel like just the lockdown went in general here?
I think it was around the 25th of March, wasn't it? It seems ages ago now. I think at the time it was quite scary because on the news we were kind of being confronted with facts like the Isle of Man's got 6 ventilators, we have a population of 85,000, and we've obviously got an ageing population and quite a number of people with like underlying health issues. So I think that was quite worrying for everyone at the time. And I remember there kind of being this like mass hysteria. And then I guess people not really knowing what was going to happen, and we were slightly behind the UK, so there was the whole thing of people running out and buying food and all the supermarkets being overwhelmed and that kind of thing. So I think in terms of work, it was a struggle. I had like 5 days a week full-time consultancy across various projects during March, and that all kind of came to an end because people were obviously concerned. No one knew what the outlook was going to be. The markets crashed, all that kind of thing. So it was overnight I pretty much lost all my work, but I was lucky enough that I could work from home. So slowly over time I kind of put time and effort into business development, online learning, webinars, that kind of thing, and then things started to improve, and I found that I was due to like technology and everything, working from home was actually okay for me. I was obviously in a fortunate situation where I didn't have to like look after children, and I had a space that I could turn into an office and that kind of thing. I did work in the tills though for a bit. In terms of, I had a bird's eye view of how the supermarkets were dealing with things, because people were obviously panicked, like members of the public were panicked, people didn't know whether they should stock up, and there was all this messaging about not kind of hoarding food and leaving it for elderly people and this kind of thing. But I think people were just genuinely like panicked and feared, and it did put retail under a lot of pressure because they didn't have there was concern over whether food supply would get through, what happens if in the UK lorries were stopped at the port or from warehouses coming through and getting to Heysham and all that kind of thing. So I think that for a lot of retailers in particular, there was a lot of pivoting and adapting and constantly changing like layouts of stores and PPE and all that kind of stuff.
So having been someone who travelled a few times from the island across, like, how do you feel like that was being handled, and do you think that it went well, or did it put a lot of stress on you?
And I found that the actual lockdown, once we went into level 5, so just kind of going back into how lockdown affected me, in that sense I was quite used to travelling pretty much every week or two for work, and I did, whilst I found the lockdown itself okay, I did start, as time went on, I did kind of feel like cabin fever creeping in, and my dad wasn't well, so I had that, it was that fear of not being able to get off the Isle of Man and not knowing when flights would go and all that kind of thing. But as soon as I'd applied for an exemption to leave on compassionate reasons, once that came through, which was really actually quite efficient, I think it only took a day to come through, I kind of felt a lot more at ease. And then that whole process of going to the airport, so the first time I went was the 15th of July, and I think it was the 20th of July when members of the public on the Isle of Man were told that they could leave and then just come back freely and self-isolate. So the airport was pretty much empty at that point. There was only 3 or 4 of us on the plane, masks, that kind of thing. Quite eerie, like the airport was very quiet, none of the shops were open. But then landing in Liverpool, it was also quite weird because the whole airport was just completely deserted, and again, all the shops, everything closed off. So it was different, and I think that's the point when I realised actually that by that point we didn't have any social distancing here, and that's when it really kind of became apparent that the Isle of Man was in such a privileged position that, we didn't have to wear masks everywhere, and you did have to consciously think about putting a mask on to get on the plane or to go into a shop in England and that kind of thing. The second time I went away, which was start of September, the airport was a lot busier, and I think people were either taking children to university or going away on holiday and less kind of maybe scared of the risks. So yeah.
The first time you went, obviously when you came back you had to isolate for 2 weeks, and how did that change the second time when you were able to do the test and at least go to shops and work if necessary?
Yeah, so the first time, again, it was kind of, when was it? August time. So I was lucky, the weather here was amazing. I could go out in the garden, all that kind of thing. So, and again, working remotely was fine for me. So actually I found during the week absolutely fine. It was the weekends were a bit harder, but again, I could go outside, sit in the garden, read a book. So it was actually okay. I was lucky I wasn't in an apartment, for example. I think that a lot of people maybe take that for granted. And then the second time, it was end of September, so definitely having the 7-day test was such an improvement for me. I think that at this time of year it's a lot harder, which is kind of weird because everyone thinks that it's raining and everyone wants to stay inside, but I think just in terms of like miserable weather, looking outside, mental health kind of implications, that just being able to actually, it was a psychological thing of being able to go for a walk and not have to worry. Like, I didn't really want to go anywhere. You know, I went for a walk, I went to the shop, but I didn't feel like, oh, I'm really missing out going to a restaurant or a cafe in that second week, for example. But I think that also kind of having that, so the first time I came back, I actually got tested in the UK before I came back to the Isle of Man. Because at that point I was very concerned. Everyone was kind of like, the hysteria was on about anyone coming back to the Isle of Man. So I wanted that kind of confidence that I didn't have it, like I wasn't COVID positive. And then the second time, obviously after the test, I had a cold, which I just picked up from the air conditioning, but it does kind of worry you. So having that test kind of put my mind at ease. And at that time I was isolating with my mum as well, because she'd been away too. So I think that it was beneficial. Yeah, and just also to have, from a kind of Isle of Man perspective, to have a bit of tracking on how many positive cases we are getting.
How do you feel about the way that the Isle of Man is dealing with the breaches in isolation?
I think that obviously it's a very kind of difficult subject. I think that there's a lot of emotion involved, and I think that obviously we only know what the press tell us, and we only really know what is kind of, I don't really know if the press are actually in court. It's kind of, we get a snapshot and it's just how it's reported in 2 or 3 headlines, which are obviously written for people to, click on or something like that. So I think that there has to be strict rules, because obviously we're very fortunate to be in this position, and it only takes one person to break isolation, especially when so many people, I think they said 10,000 people have now travelled. To think that many people have stuck to it and self-isolated, and then all it takes is 1 or 2. And, people have been in difficult positions where they've not been able to get paid for their self-isolation, so they've made sacrifices along the way. And then you get people that just make really stupid decisions to go to McDonald's or to, stop off at the shop on the way home. But I also think that there needs to be maybe some stronger communication with people as they get off the boat, as they come through the airport, to really make sure that everyone understands it. I'm early 30s. My early 30s, I'm online all the time. Like, I pretty much live, and communicate online like day in, day out. So I'm very aware of the rules. But if you're maybe slightly older, you don't have that access to technology. A lot of people, it's not them trying to break the law, they just don't maybe understand. But hopefully time's enough. I think there's been enough. I think today they've said 16 people in total have been in prison, so I feel like now there's enough people.
Point about the older people, because even like my dad is someone who is online a lot, but he doesn't really use social media. So for example, in March when they put in the 40-mile-an-hour speed limit, like, he wasn't aware of that until I told him. So, and it's not like he wanted to, he'd be breaking the law, but like you said, it's just not being aware or ignorant of the law. The
challenges of lockdown, I think, from a business perspective, I was fortunate that I could pick up new clients, but I think it's been really challenging for a lot of people. So in my family, I've people working in retail and hospitality, and also childcare, and I think that whilst the income, everyone's it's been very difficult on people's income, it's also been kind of a very stressful situation, because people have been really concerned about their jobs, about, for example, in retail, people are trying to keep up with the changes, trying to do the best for their customers, whilst also taking on extra staff to cover people that might have had to self-isolate and the additional costs that come with that. In childcare, obviously, it's very, you can't, like, the challenges of if you had to go to a situation where you're social distancing with 2-year-olds and all the implications that come with that, like, it's very difficult. And obviously we've come through a period where the government did move quickly and people managed to get a lot of support. People now are still on Mira. We're 6-7 months on, and a lot of that support is going to continue for certain industries. But I think that we, if we're still in this position in 6 months' time, is that support, at the back of business owners' minds, is that support going to be available? And will their staff, will they be in a position to protect their staff in the same way that they've been able to protect them during this kind of period?
One thing I will tag on to the end of the whole talking about the Isle of Man and the travelling and isolation when you return is, I think that the system is great, that everyone who travels should be isolating for the 14 days. Personally, I thought that being able to utilize that test, to take the test on the 7th day, to then be released on day 8, it was great for the person going through isolation, because there's a huge difference between doing 8 days and being able to go to the shops than not being allowed out for the entire 14 days. But I also think that because so many were utilizing the test, we were able to see how many people were bringing the virus back. And yes, they are staying isolated, but when someone would test positive on that 8th day, that meant that they had to reset their 14 days. So now people who are asymptomatic, they're not being tested, because why would they? They've stopped this day 8 option, and people with symptoms are still being tested, but that means that up day 14 they're going out anyway. So by having that test on day 7, we're picking up way more of the virus than we would if we're just testing people who are symptomatic. I think that the day 7 test, when done the correct way, is great, and I think that it should be allowed back. But the one thing where I personally see a break in the system is, say someone goes away and they spend their time in the UK or wherever else, they return to the island. Now, as I've said, I live by myself. When I come back, I close my apartment door, no one sees me, no one interacts with me, and that's it until when I came out on day 8 after having my test, and that was only to the shops, and I was still doing all the precautions that they told me to do. And on day 14, okay, I was free again and I had no more precautions or rules to follow. But if someone returns, like the university students who are returning this week from England because they don't want to sit and be locked down in England to only return in December. So a lot of the university students are coming back. Now, a lot of them are going into certain Airbnbs or hotels, cottages, etc., and isolating there because they don't have the space or ability to quarantine where they live. Say they only live in a 2-bedroom flat with 1 bathroom, that's not a great situation. But if they have the ability, they have 3 or 4 rooms, they have several bathrooms, they can kind of cut themselves off in an area of the house, use the 1 bathroom, stay in their room, and that's it. But if someone is going back from university and they're going into a house with, say, 2 parents and 2 siblings, the rest of that household can still go about their daily activities. Now, a lot of people will basically lock down their house, and I know people who the students are returning and they're basically saying, no one is coming over, we're not leaving the house, we're going to work from home, everything. And certain companies are stating that if you have someone in your family that is returning, you can't come into work, and that should be the way that everybody is going. And now, will there be circumstances where some people can't get paid for working at home, some people can't get approved to do that because of the nature of their job? But I think that anybody who possibly can lock down their entire house, if someone is coming back, they should be doing that. That was the way it was in the very beginning, because there's certain people I know where one of the spouses travelled and the other spouse and children did not, but when they came back, the entire household had to lock down. And I think that is way more an issue than the people getting the actual test on day 7. So I don't know, maybe that's something that they'll look at now, because the UK is at such a bad level, and the UK is going back into lockdown. After I had returned to the island during the end of September, we began to get a number of travel related positive tests. Now, the Isle of Man still remained completely COVID free, as we did not have any community cases, and that is what all the medical bodies define COVID free as. So the Isle of Man still remains, to this day, completely COVID free. But a number of people who had come to the island as key workers, because we are a small population, we do require key workers to come over and do certain jobs over here. So a number of those key workers who are not island residents tested positive, a very small number, and an even smaller number of island residents who had travelled tested positive. Now, this was approximately 5 or 6 people in total for the last month and a half, so it was nothing significant. None of them required hospitalisation, and all of them were already self-isolating per the rules in the Isle of Man about anyone coming to the island having to self-isolate. Due to these small number of travel-related cases, on the 8th of October, the Isle of Man announced that they would be revoking the option to do the 7-day test, and that Sunday on the 11th was when the option to do the test would be withdrawn. The option to do the test has not been reinstated. A lot of people have spoken out saying that they think that there really isn't any reason for this day 7 test being revoked, and a lot of people believe that the weakness in the Isle of Man wall of COVID protection is the fact that people returning to the island can self-isolate in their home with family, roommates, etc. And those people in that home can go about their normal lives. Now, in the beginning, people who were self-isolating, if there was anyone else in that house who hadn't travelled, they still had to self-isolate. So there has been a number of people speaking out about them believing that we should go back to the old system of, if anyone in the household travels, the entire household has to self-isolate. Now that you're all caught up with how the Isle of Man dealt with and completely eradicated coronavirus, let's talk about how the Isle of Man has been dealing with people who break this 14-day isolation period that anyone who comes to the island is required to do. Now, in total, since the island has started prosecuting people for the breaking of self-isolation, there have been 16 people that have been jailed for breaking their quarantine. Now, of course, every time this happens, the media has a clickbaity title that goes on social media, and everyone is completely interested in what this person did. And you all know that social media just brings out the best in people, and everybody becomes judge, jury, and executioner. So just to let you know how it basically works, when you are a resident and you go away, you fill in a little form before you go that takes 2 seconds that just says, I want to go away, this is my name, address, phone number. You send it in, you get an almost immediate reply saying, yep, you can go away, here's your little travel number. And when you are coming back, within 48 hours of arriving back, you need to fill out a landing form, because when you arrive, you need to hand this landing form in. So I went away on the boat and I took my car, so I was driving on the boat, driving off. So when I went away, I filled in my landing form. When I drove off the boat, which you normally don't need ID to go on the boat, so they did tell you you need to have ID to hand in this landing form. So the landing form basically asks you for your name, address, phone number, where you're going to be isolating, you have to sign something saying you've read the form, you know the rules, and it just lays out, you know, you can't go outside, you can't go to the store and all these things. And when I drove off the boat, I gave them my ID, I gave them my landing form. They basically said to me, you understand this, you signed this, you know you have to quarantine. I said yes. I drove straight home, quarantined for my 7 days, went and got my test, was allowed out to the shops and stuff on day 8, finished on day 14. Now, any resident who returns, that should be the way it is. And on the Isle of Man, there is also a small number of people who come over as what's described as a key worker. Because the Isle of Man has quite a small population, we do need people who have certain job skills to come over, as we either won't have someone with that job skill or we won't have enough of them. So at the moment there's a lot of construction key workers over, as we're having a number of roads redone. So when you arrive on the island, you obviously get this landing form, everyone does, and there are also signs all over the place saying that you have to quarantine. And it's, you know, extremely general knowledge because this has been going on since March. So in total, the number of people who have been arrested and sentenced to prison terms for breaking their quarantine period is 16. Now, of course, when this happens, we all know that the media and social media just brings out really the best in people. So the media will create a very clickbaity title and they will put this on social media, and once it's on social media, everyone, you know, likes to have a good old nosy at what the latest quarantine rule breaker has done, and then everybody becomes judge, jury and executioner and just goes off in the comment section. I'm not gonna lie, they are an interesting read sometimes because people they are wild and it is kind of funny, but sometimes people just take it way too far. One of the biggest headlines for COVID breaking of the rules was when there were 5 key workers from England and they all were arrested and jailed for breaking their quarantine period. Most of the time it's people going either to the pub for a drink or people going to shops for food or lunch or something. And the one thing that really stands out to me is most of the time is because these people have either posted about it on social media about breaking the rule, or they have told people in the shop that they've broken the rule, which is just lunacy. We had one young man who broke the isolation to go to our one and only McDonald's, which, because you think of a worse place to go, that place is always so busy. So if he did have the virus, it would have been terrible because so many people would have been exposed to it. The day that I returned to the island and I was on the boat, there was a woman who was on the boat with me and she was driving home and she stopped at my local gas station, petrol station right here, and she needed to fill up her car. Now, should she have done this before she got on the boat? Of course she should have, because that's what I did. But also do have a smidgen of sympathy because maybe she forgot or didn't look at her gas tank. I mean, you know, you could go back and forward all day talking about this, but the really terrible thing is that she actually looks after an elderly gentleman who's in his 80s, I believe, and she was actually sentenced to a jail sentence of a few weeks. So the person that gets hurt in that situation is obviously the elderly gentleman. Should she have read the rules and stuck to them? Of course, but as we all know, no one is perfect and people make mistakes, so it's just so difficult because you can see it from both sides. I mean, there was another terrible case where there was a gentleman who went to a food bank to get food, and you know, like, obviously should have reached out to someone somewhere, or one of the, you know, there's a lot of COVID groups on the Isle of Man that will help you and go to stores for you or bring you food and help in any way. So of course it's easy to sit here and say, well, they should have done this, they should have done that, but we're all human and we all make mistakes. And now just for my general thoughts on how everything has gone from lockdown to how the Isle of Man is tracking and tracing, how they're punishing people who break the isolation. So the lockdown, I think they did the best they possibly could. We were extremely strict, extremely draconian. Everybody, for the most part, obeyed the rules. And I believe that that extremely, extremely strict lockdown that we did is what got us through to the other side, and how now we are absolutely reaping the benefits of it by having, for all intents and purposes, a completely normal life. Okay, if you go away, when you come back you have to isolate for 2 weeks, but that's it. That is currently the only infringement on our lives that is different in any way from this time last year. Nobody has to wear masks, nobody has to socially distance, and as you saw from the clip at the very beginning of this video, people are able to meet up in groups of 8, 9, 10, hug each other, sit next to each other in a restaurant, be in a crowded cafe, everything. Like, there is nothing at all apart from our 2 weeks of isolation if you travel. However, in an abundance of caution, do I think that we should be trying to track and trace in the absolute worst case scenario if something like what happened in Guernsey happens here, where, to just give a quick summary, after being COVID free for a very long time, they had a small number of cases, community cases, pop up last week, and that has caused the air bridge from the Isle of Man to be closed. And the air bridge was, people could go there and come back to the island without having to isolate. It was the only place they could do that because they were also COVID free, but because they have these few cases that have popped up, that now that air bridge has been stopped, and it was stopped a few days before half term too, so it was very unfortunate timing. But my personal opinion is we should be behaving as if we do have COVID here with the tracking and tracing, so that, for example, the clip at the very beginning, the restaurant that I was in, if there was a circumstance where we really unfortunately did have a community case, that they could hit that button and the alert could go out to everyone, hey, you were in this restaurant, this person's tested positive, please isolate. As I was saying when we were talking about the day 7 test, day 8 release, I really think that should be reinstated. We are in a very fortunate position that we weren't at the beginning of this, in that we have our own lab set up on the island now, and according to the most qualified person on the island that's in there testing every day, Dr. Glover, it's gold standard, and we have a much higher capacity than we are currently doing. I know the island is very split on where people stand with the border. There's a number of people who want the border to be pushed back to level 5, and there's a number of people who want the border to be lowered to level 3, in that people who have strong ties to the island, such as, you know, if one of my siblings wanted to come over, if someone's children wanted to come over, mother, father, etc., that they would be able to do so. And with the UK going back into a lockdown, I think that level 4 is kind of a comfortable middle ground, in that the self-isolating for 14 days is the gold standard of protecting ourselves, and for the most part people are following that rule. I have not been able to lay my hand on exact figures for how many people have travelled since the border was lowered to level 14, but it's believed to be between 10 and 20,000, which is about a quarter of the population of the island. And for the most part, there's been 16 people jailed for breaking that isolation period. Now, is it unfortunate that there was anyone who broke it? Of course. People are signing a legal document saying that they are going to follow the rules, and the majority of those people were key workers who, I don't know, maybe they think that they can get away with things over here because there doesn't really seem to be a lot of enforcement anywhere else in the world when it comes to breaking these regulations, but the Isle of Man is actively enforcing them, which I think they should. And I think that it's been abundantly clear that that 14-day self-isolation period is working, as we have had a number of travel related cases. There is 7 at the moment, and all of those people are currently self-isolating and have not broken lockdown, so there's been absolutely no risk to the community. And now for my final thoughts. Are we in a great position in the Isle of Man? You bet we are. We are living our normal day-to-day life. I can go over right now to my dad's, to my cousins, uncles, anyone, and give them a hug. I can go out to dinner with 10 of my friends tonight, and there's no masks, no social distancing, nothing. I think for the majority, government locked down as soon as we could, and we were in a fortunate position that we were a little bit behind the UK in that we didn't get a case until a lot of people were already working from home, and we closed the border and locked down immediately. We also managed to get a lab up and running that is operating to gold standard, that is being run by some fantastic hardworking people that do not get enough praise in my opinion. I think the border is in a good position right now in that anybody who wants to go away and see their family is able to do so, but they must self-isolate. It only takes one person to break those rules and to be infected with the virus, asymptomatic or symptomatic, and to go out into the population and expose us all to the virus. Personally, I would love to see some form of tracking and tracing implemented into society, at least in restaurants, cinema, big public places like that, big events, where if the worst does happen, that we can catch it and contain it very quickly. Right now, I don't see any reason for us to be pushed back up to level 5, because what we are doing is working with the 14-day self-isolation. But right now, with the UK being put into their own lockdown, as much as I miss my family and close friends being able to visit, because of the situation in the UK right now, I do not think that we should be moved to level 3. But overall, I think the one main thing, the reason that the Isle of Man has got to where it is and been so successful in eradicating the coronavirus is the people on the island. It's a very unique place in that everyone knows everyone, and I think that worked out extremely well in the sense that no one would risk violating the rules because everybody knows everyone. I think that the reason that we were able to get such a control on it so quickly was because everyone on the island did what they were supposed to do. They followed the rules. It's as simple as that. Everybody got that community spirit, and it wasn't about me. Everyone on the Isle of Man made sacrifices, gave things up, missed seeing their family and friends, and were in an extremely strict lockdown that had a lot of repercussions that some people are really still feeling the effects of, whether it be financial, mental health, or a host of other reasons. The community spirit in the Isle of Man has been fantastic through this whole virus. If you go onto any Facebook groups or social media in any form, there's countless groups willing to help people out in any circumstance, which again shows how there is never any need for anyone to break isolation, because there is so much help available, even if you are someone who doesn't have family or friends here. There's always someone to turn to on the Isle of Man, and I think that is the number one reason that we've got to where we've got to. It really is the people of the Isle of Man that has made this happen. Yes, the government did things right. Yes, we are an island, and there's a host of other mitigating circumstances that has led us to this point. But my belief is honestly that it is the unique community spirit on the Isle of Man that has allowed us to get to this over 100 days COVID-free. And on the 20th of November, the Isle of Man will hopefully celebrate 6 months of being COVID-free. And that's a wrap for this video, guys. Pretty different from what I normally do. I really hope that you enjoyed hearing about how the Isle of Man has dealt with COVID and the unique position that we're in over here. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. And if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up as it really helps out the channel. If you have any questions about anything in this video, about the Isle of Man in general, or just about how we dealt with COVID, please pop them down in the comment section down below, or feel free to go over to my social media and I'll pop them all up here for you. Give me a follow over there and drop some questions in the comment section for me also. I know that it's a bit of a tough time, especially in the UK at the moment, where everyone is going back into another lockdown and just some other circumstances in the world. So please always feel free to reach out to me in any of my comment section on social media, or if you're not comfortable doing it on public, feel free to send me a message on any of my platforms. And the most important thing is that everyone is taking care of themselves and staying safe. So make sure that no matter what you have to do, look after yourself. And I'll be back very soon with another video. So thank you so much for watching, everyone. It really, really means a lot. Make sure that you're looking after yourself, staying safe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.